Hey guys, today's history begins with something that sounds almost too ordinary to notice. A cup of water. But in the medieval world, drinking water was not simply a matter of thirst. It was tied to mud, wells, animals, waste, weather, fear, habit, and the quiet knowledge that what looked clear could still make a person ill. Before we settle into it, let me know where you're watching from and what history topic you'd like to hear next. If you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a like is a simple way to support it. And if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating history, you're very welcome to subscribe. So let's begin not with a castle or a battlefield or a king, but with an ordinary medieval person lowering a bucket into a well, hoping that what came back up would be safe enough. For many modern viewers, the easy version of this story is that medieval people avoided water because it was filthy and drank ale or wine instead. There is some truth hiding inside that idea, but the full picture is more interesting and much more human. Medieval people did drink water. They knew the difference between fresh water and foul water. They valued clean springs, clear streams, and wells that were carefully kept. They were not foolish and they were not helpless. But they lived in a world where keeping water clean was difficult in ways that are hard to imagine now. Water did not arrive through treated pipes. It did not pass through modern filtration. It did not come with invisible guarantees from engineers, inspectors, and public health systems. It came from the landscape nearby, from rain collected in barrels, from streams running past fields and roads, from wells dug into uncertain ground, from rivers that carried both life and waste through the middle of towns. And that is where the real discomfort begins. The danger was not always obvious. A person could look at a cup of water and see nothing alarming. It might be cold. It might be clear. It might taste normal. Yet somewhere upstream, animals may have crossed it. A latrine may have drained too close to it. A flood may have washed filth into it. A dead creature may have spoiled it. Or the well itself may have been placed in ground already touched by refuse. In the countryside, water could seem safer because people were closer to springs, brooks, and wells used by smaller communities. But even there, the daily relationship with water was fragile. Livestock drank from the same streams people used. Pigs rooted in yards. Chickens wandered. Cattle stood in mud. Human waste was managed with pits, ditches, and distance rather than sealed sanitation. A household might know which well was trusted and which ditch to avoid, but bad weather could rearrange everything. Heavy rain could carry contamination across the ground. Summer heat could thicken smells and spoil standing water. Winter ice could make access harder and force people toward whatever source remained usable. In towns, the problem became more crowded, more complicated, and more constant. Medieval towns were living organisms packed tightly inside walls. Markets, lanes, yards, workshops, stables, kitchens, churches, and houses. Water was needed everywhere. Brewers needed it. Bakers needed it. Butchers needed it. Tanners, dyers, fullers, cooks, washerwomen, horses, cattle, pigs, and thousands of residents all pressed against the same limited supplies. A town river might be beautiful from a distance, catching the light beneath bridges and church towers. But up close, it could also be a working drain. It carried waste from households, scraps from markets, blood and offal from butchers, dyes from cloth workers, mud from streets, and whatever rain washed down from the crowded lanes. People might still use parts of it, especially where water moved quickly, but they also understood that not every stretch of river was equally good. There were rules in some towns about where certain trades could dump waste, where animals could be washed, where people could draw water, and how wells should be protected. That is one of the first important truths. Medieval people did not always lack awareness. Often they lacked control. A town could pass a rule against fouling a water source. A community could punish someone for dumping filth too close to a well. A monastery could manage its water channels with impressive care. A wealthy household could pay servants to fetch better water from farther away. But enforcement was uneven, knowledge was incomplete, and daily necessity was stronger than ideal order. When many people lived close together without modern sewage systems, water was always at risk from the ordinary business of being alive. This is why ale and beer matter in the story, but not in the exaggerated way they are sometimes told. In much of medieval Europe, low-strength ale or small beer was common, especially in regions where grain brewing was part of everyday life. Wine served a similar role in wine-growing areas. These drinks were not always consumed because every drop of water was known to be deadly. They were consumed because they were nourishing, familiar, socially normal, and often safer or more reliable than questionable water. Brewing involved boiling or heating the liquid at some stage, and fermentation made the drink less friendly to some forms of spoilage. It also provided calories, taste, and comfort, but this did not mean people walked around constantly drunk. Everyday ale could be much weaker than modern strong beer. Children might drink diluted versions. Laborers might drink it as part of their daily food supply. Monastic communities carefully measured allowances. Households brewed regularly because ale did not keep forever, and fresh batches were part of the rhythm of domestic work. The twist is that ale was not simply a replacement for water. It was part of a larger survival system. Medieval people used water for cooking, washing, brewing, cleaning, soaking grain, tending animals, and mixing medicines. They judged it by source, smell, taste, movement, reputation, and season. They made choices within limits. A fresh spring had a special status because it seemed alive. Moving water was often trusted more than stagnant water. Wells were valuable because they could offer access away from open street filth, but only if they were properly located and maintained. Rainwater might be useful, but collection vessels could become dirty. Cisterns could help, but they required care. Rivers could serve many needs, but they could also betray the town that depended on them. In some places, people built surprisingly thoughtful water systems. Monasteries, especially larger and wealthier ones, could channel water through conduits, fish ponds, kitchens, wash areas, and latrine systems. Certain medieval towns developed public fountains, conduits, and piped water from cleaner sources outside the crowded center. London, for example, had medieval conduits bringing water into parts of the city, though access was limited and contested. These systems remind us that medieval society was not indifferent to clean water. Clean water was recognized as valuable. That is exactly why it was fought over, protected, sold, regulated, and sometimes stolen. But for ordinary people, access depended heavily on status and location. A wealthy household might have servants fetch water from a better source. A religious house might control a spring. A castle might have a deep well inside its walls, not only for comfort but for survival during siege. A poor household in a crowded lane might rely on a neighborhood well shared by many people, or on vendors who carried water through the streets. The same town could contain both careful water management and deeply unsafe water habits, side by side. This inequality shaped daily life in quiet ways. Fetching water was labor, took time, strength, and repetition. Buckets were heavy. Streets were muddy. Water had to be carried home before it could become soup, porridge, ale, washing water, or something to drink. In households without servants, this work often fell into the daily routine of women, children, apprentices, or lower-status workers. A clean cup of water in that world was not just a natural convenience. It was the result of distance, labor, judgment, and luck. And then there was illness. Medieval people did not understand microbes in the modern scientific sense. They did not know about bacteria, viruses, or parasites as we describe them today. But they did connect foul smells, rotting matter, bad air, corrupted food, and dirty surroundings with sickness. Their explanations were different from ours, often shaped by ideas of miasma, humors, balance, divine judgment, and environmental corruption. Yet their observations were not always useless. If a well smelled bad, if water tasted strange, if a ditch was full of filth, people could recognize danger even without modern germ theory. The difficulty was that the most dangerous contamination did not always announce itself. Water could be harmful without smelling terrible. Disease could spread through a community before anyone understood the chain of cause and effect. A family might blame a fever on bad air, spoiled food, the season, weakness, or God's will, while the actual source might be a well quietly contaminated by waste. This uncertainty made medieval drinking water psychologically uncomfortable as well as physically risky. People lived with practical instincts but not full explanations. They could avoid what looked foul. They could prefer certain sources. They could boil liquids for cooking. They could drink ale. They could trust the well their neighbors trusted. But they could not see the invisible. That invisible uncertainty is one reason the medieval water story feels so strange to modern ears. We are used to turning a tap and assuming that safety has already been handled by someone else. Medieval people had to think locally. Who used this source? What lies uphill? Has the weather changed? Is the well covered? Has the river risen? Are animals near it? Has someone fouled it? Is this water for drinking or only for washing? Has the household ale run out? Is there enough fuel to heat more liquid? Is there time to fetch better water? A simple drink became a chain of small decisions. The more crowded a place became, the more these decisions mattered. In a small village, reputation and habit could help. People knew the spring, the well, the stream crossing, the family whose animals wandered too close. In a large town, the scale of human activity made trust harder. Strangers came and went. Markets produced waste. Crafts polluted water. Streets collected filth. Wells served many households. A source that was acceptable one season might become dangerous after a flood, a drought, or careless dumping. And medieval towns could smell. That does not mean every street was constantly unbearable, or that people lived in a cartoonish world of filth. But dense settlement before modern sanitation produced odors that were part of the environment. Animals, smoke, dung, damp straw, fish, leatherworking, brewing, baking, latrines, open drains, and wet earth. Water moved through this same world, touched the same ground. It carried traces of the same human and animal life. Still, it is important not to exaggerate medieval misery into stupidity. People valued freshness. They covered wells. They cleaned conduits. They argued over rights to water. They placed fines on pollution. They built wash places downstream from drinking places when they could. They knew that water from a clear spring was not the same as water from a ditch beside a road. Much of medieval life was not ignorance, but negotiation with imperfect conditions. This negotiation appeared even in medicine and religion. Springs could be associated with healing, saints, pilgrimage, and local devotion. Some waters were believed to have special powers. Holy wells drew visitors. Ritual washing had spiritual meanings. At the same time, practical concerns remained. A holy spring still had to be reached. A town fountain still had to be maintained. A monastery channel still had to be kept clear. The sacred and the practical often flowed through the same landscape. Water also revealed how dependent medieval people were on the seasons. In spring, melting snow and rain could swell rivers and wash refuse into places it did not usually go. In summer, shallow water could stagnate, and the smell of waste could become stronger. In autumn, rains returned, churning mud through lanes and yards. In winter, frozen surfaces and cold winds made fetching water harder, while indoor life increased the need for cooking, brewing, and washing in cramped spaces. A household might adapt without thinking of it as adaptation. They might drink more ale when available. They might boil water in pottage. They might use water from one source for washing and another for cooking. They might send someone farther away for better water when illness had touched the neighborhood. They might trust old advice. Avoid water that was still, warm, foul-smelling, or near obvious waste. These habits were not perfect, but they were not meaningless. And then there were moments when water became political. Control over a good water source could create power. A lord, monastery, town council, guild, or wealthy property owner might control access to wells, conduits, ponds, or streams. In crowded settlements, public water points could become places of gossip, conflict, waiting, and social observation. A fountain was not only infrastructure, it was a meeting point. A well was not only a hole in the ground, it was part of the social map. During siege warfare, water could decide survival. Castles needed wells or cisterns because walls were useless if thirst forced surrender. Attackers might try to cut off water, poison supplies, or control nearby streams. Defenders guarded wells carefully. In this setting, drinking water was not a background detail. It was strategy. Even in peacetime, water could shape where people lived and how towns grew. Settlements clustered near rivers and springs because water was essential for life and work. Yet the same river that made a town possible could become polluted by the town itself. This is one of the central contradictions of medieval urban life. The thing that allowed growth also carried the consequences of growth back through the community. A river powered mills, moved goods, watered animals, supported fishing, served crafts, cleaned tools, and received waste. It was useful because it moved. But because it moved, it also connected one person's actions to another person's risk. What was dumped upstream might arrive downstream as someone else's problem. That is why the story of unsafe medieval drinking water is not only about dirt. It is about systems before modern systems. It is about how communities tried to manage shared resources with limited tools, uneven authority, and incomplete knowledge. It is about how ordinary people made careful choices in a world where safety depended on proximity, memory, smell, labor, and chance. And perhaps the most quietly unsettling part is that water could look peaceful while carrying danger. A well in a courtyard, a bucket beside a door, a wooden cup on a table, a stream moving beyond the edge of a village. These do not look dramatic. They look ordinary. But medieval life often hid its hardest problems inside ordinary things. A person waking before dawn might not begin the day with fear. They might begin with chores, fire to tend, grain to prepare, animals to check, children to feed, work to reach, and somewhere in that rhythm came water. Fetched, poured, heated, mixed, shared, spilled, saved. Most days it did what water was supposed to do. It sustained life quietly. But when it failed, the failure could move through a household before anyone understood why a child might develop a fever that seemed to come from nowhere. A laborer who had worked the same fields for years might suddenly be weakened by stomach sickness. A household could blame the season, bad luck, spoiled food, or a curse whispered about by anxious neighbors. Sometimes they would be partly right. Illness rarely came from only one cause in medieval life. Malnutrition, cold, exhaustion, poor housing, and contaminated water often work together, each making the others worse. This is another reason the question of drinking water cannot be separated from the wider conditions of daily life. A strong, well-fed person drinking from a questionable source might recover from an illness that would be devastating to a child already weakened by winter hunger. A noble household with access to better food, private wells, and servants to manage domestic work lived in a very different world from a crowded family in a narrow town lane sharing a water source with half the neighborhood. Water, like so much else in medieval society, revealed class without needing to announce it. In a great household, water might arrive carried by servants in clean vessels, drawn from a preferred source chosen for taste and reputation. Kitchens were large enough to organize separate work, and brewing was often done on a serious scale. Bathing, though less frequent than modern habits, could still be managed with tubs, heated water, and privacy. Even here, none of this guaranteed safety, but wealth increased the number of choices. For the poor, the margin for error was much thinner. If the nearest well was bad, fetching from a better one cost time and strength. If fuel for boiling was scarce, there was little room for caution. If ale supplies ran low, people drank what they had. If illness came, there were fewer ways to respond. A day lost to sickness could mean hunger by the end of the week. And because towns were social places, danger could spread not only through water itself, but through the shared routines built around it. Women gathering at a fountain, apprentices carrying buckets for workshops, servants moving through markets, vendors filling barrels, brewers collecting supplies. Water linked people together long before anyone understood infection in modern terms. There were also animals everywhere. This is easy to underestimate because modern cities are built around separation. Medieval towns were not. Horses moved goods. Oxen pulled carts. Pigs wandered streets in many places. Chickens scratched in yards. Dogs lingered near kitchens and markets. Cattle passed through lanes. Manure was not an occasional inconvenience. It was part of the ordinary environment. Animals needed water, and animals affected water. They drank from streams, stood in mud, and left waste near wells and paths. A village pond might serve livestock and still remain part of the household landscape. A stream could be both practical and suspect at the same time. Even in castles, where people often imagine cleaner order, the reality could be complicated. A castle well was precious, especially during siege, but maintaining clean water inside enclosed walls was difficult. Human waste, animals, kitchens, storage, and defensive needs all existed in compressed space. If a siege lasted long enough, sanitation became part of military strategy. Thirst and contamination could weaken defenders as effectively as weapons. Monasteries offer another useful contrast. Many monastic communities, especially wealthy ones, took water management seriously. Rules of cleanliness, organized labor, gardens, fish ponds, kitchens, infirmaries, and latrine systems required planning. Some monasteries directed running water through parts of the complex with impressive engineering. They were not modern sanitary systems, but they reflected a clear understanding that water order mattered. Yet monasteries were not isolated from the world around them. Their lands depended on nearby streams, rivers, and agricultural systems. Pilgrims arrived. Workers moved in and out. Animals were kept. Disease still entered. Even the most disciplined institution could not fully escape the environmental realities of the age. This tension between intention and limitation runs through the whole subject. Medieval people often tried to do sensible things. The problem was not always ignorance. It was scale, technology, and circumstance. Take the common advice to prefer running water over still water. This was often practical wisdom. A flowing stream could appear fresher and be less visibly stagnant than a pond. But a stream also carried everything from upstream. If a village upstream washed animals there, if waste drained into it, if a storm had swept filth into the current, the movement that made it seem cleaner could also spread contamination farther. or consider wells. A well felt secure because it separated drinking water from the open street. It reached downward into the earth, protected from obvious surface dirt. But if it was dug too close to latrines, refuse pits, or animal enclosures, danger could seep invisibly through the soil. Medieval builders did not always understand the hidden movement of contamination underground. They judged by experience, taste, and local knowledge. Sometimes that knowledge was sharp. People knew certain wells had bad reputations. Certain springs were trusted for generations. Some neighborhoods were known for better water than others. Reputation itself became a form of infrastructure. In a way, people drank not only water but memory. They trusted what parents had trusted. They avoided what neighbors warned against. They knew which fountain produced the sweetest taste, which riverbank was safest for washing clothes, which side of town had better ale, which season made the old well unpleasant. Oral knowledge substituted for scientific explanation, and while imperfect, it often kept communities functioning. This makes the phrase unsafe water more complicated than it first appears. It was not a constant emergency in which everyone was poisoned all the time. If that were true, towns could not have survived. Instead, it was a shifting background risk, sometimes manageable, sometimes suddenly dangerous. A dry summer could lower water levels and concentrate filth. Heavy rain could overwhelm drains and pits. A harsh winter could force desperate choices. A crowded fair or pilgrimage season could strain local supplies. War could destroy wells, contaminate streams, or drive displaced people into settlements not prepared to support them. And then there were outbreaks that seemed to arrive like invisible weather. Dysentery, fevers, stomach illnesses, and recurring intestinal diseases could pass through communities with terrible familiarity. Medieval records often describe suffering without giving us modern diagnosis. Priests recorded burials. Chroniclers described illness. Household accounts showed sudden disruptions. What they leave behind is often not a clean medical explanation, but the texture of uncertainty. Someone was well last week and buried this week. A servant disappears from the household records. A village priest notes too many funerals in one season. A monastery infirmary becomes busier than usual. A town council issues new rules about waste disposal or cleaning streets. Behind these fragments, water is often present even when unnamed. One of the strongest modern misconceptions is that medieval people passively accepted all of this. In reality, many towns actively tried to regulate cleanliness. Officials inspected wells. Fines were issued for dumping waste where it should not be dumped. Butchers could be restricted in where they disposed of blood and offal. Tanners and dyers, whose trades required strong chemicals and created powerful smells, were often pushed toward the edges of towns or downstream areas. These regulations tell us something important. People complained. They noticed bad smells. They argued about filth. They fought over rights to clean water. They understood that one person's convenience could become another person's sickness. Urban government, even in imperfect medieval form, often revolved around these deeply practical tensions. And this also shaped social reputation. A clean household suggested discipline and status. A neglected yard or foul-smelling ditch could invite judgment. Public cleanliness was never purely private. In close communities, everyone's habits touched everyone else. This helps explain why brewing remained so central. Ale was not only a safer drink in many cases, it was also a way of stabilizing household life. Brewing turned grain and water into something more reliable, more caloric, and often more socially valued. A household without enough ale faced inconvenience beyond taste. It meant greater dependence on uncertain water and greater vulnerability during illness. Women often stood at the center of this domestic brewing economy. In many ordinary households, brewing was part of routine female labor, alongside baking, cooking, washing, and managing food stores. Before brewing became more commercialized in later periods, the household brewer was often not a distant professional but someone inside the home, balancing timing, ingredients, fuel, and preservation against all the other demands of survival. So when we imagine medieval drinking habits, it should not be a rowdy tavern first, but a kitchen. Steam rising, grain soaking, barrels being watched. A mother deciding whether the last of yesterday's ale should be saved for supper. A servant returning late because the better well had a long line. These small domestic decisions mattered far more than the dramatic image of drunken peasants often repeated in popular imagination. Even children fit into this quieter picture. Depending on place, age, and household custom, children might drink weak ale, diluted wine, watered beverages, milk where available, or plain water from trusted sources. The goal was not indulgence, but practicality. Nutrition and safety mattered more than modern categories. Medical advice of the period also reflected this balancing act. Physicians and learned writers discussed which waters were best: spring water, rainwater, river water, depending on context, and how water should be judged by clarity, smell, taste, and source. Some recommended boiling, settling, or mixing. Their theories were framed through humoral medicine rather than microbiology, but they were still attempts to reason carefully about health. A physician might describe certain waters as too heavy, too cold, too corrupt, too likely to disturb the balance of the body. Modern science would not agree with every conclusion, but the impulse was familiar. People were trying to understand why some drinking made people well and some made them sick. And perhaps nowhere did this matter more emotionally than during plague years. The Black Death and later plague outbreaks were not caused by drinking water in the simple sense, but times of plague intensified every fear about corruption, contamination, and the hidden movement of death through ordinary life. Wells, fountains, streets, air, clothing, food. Everything became suspect. When death seemed to move invisibly, water naturally entered the field of anxiety. People searched for causes they could grasp. They cleaned streets. They prayed. They blamed bad air, divine punishment, foreigners, moral failure, unlucky stars, poisoned wells. Some accusations became tragic and violent. Fear around water could become social fear, and social fear could become persecution. This is where the subject becomes darker. Water was never just physical. Carried trust. Who touched it? Who controlled it? Who was blamed when illness came? A poisoned well was not only a health fear. It was a fear about community itself, that the thing sustaining life had been turned against it. Most of the time, of course, no conspiracy was needed. Contamination came from ordinary pressure. Too many people, too little infrastructure, too much waste, too much weather, too little distance between necessity and danger. But ordinary causes are often harder for human beings to accept than dramatic ones. A villain is simpler than a drainage problem. And so medieval life continued in that uncertain middle ground, between practical caution and incomplete understanding, between trusted habits and invisible risks, between the spring everyone swore by and the fever no one could explain. A traveler arriving in a new town had to learn quickly which water to trust. A servant sent to fetch water knew which streets to avoid after rain. A widow living alone knew exactly how much strength a full bucket demanded. A brewer watched the quality of water as closely as the grain. A monk noticed when the conduit ran slower than usual. And a town council, somewhere behind stone walls and parchment records, argued again about the same old problem: how to keep a growing town alive when the very water beneath it could not always be trusted. Because as medieval Europe grew larger, richer, and more crowded, that problem only became harder. Because as medieval Europe grew larger, richer, and more crowded, that problem only became harder. Success itself created pressure. A prosperous market town attracted traders, craftsmen, laborers, pilgrims, and migrants from the countryside. New houses were built where there had once been gardens. Workshops spread closer to wells. Animals were kept in tighter quarters. Waste accumulated faster than old habits of disposal could manage. The very signs of economic life, busy streets, crowded inns, active markets, new construction, also increased the strain on water. This is one reason medieval cities often seem contradictory to modern eyes. They could be centers of wealth, learning, religion, and political sophistication, while also struggling with problems as basic as clean drinking water. A cathedral might rise magnificently above streets where residents still argued over drains and foul ditches. A royal court could dine with elaborate ceremony while servants worried about the condition of the kitchen well. Progress did not erase vulnerability. In some ways, it deepened it. London offers a useful example, not because it was unique, but because it was large enough for these tensions to become especially visible. The city depended heavily on the River Thames, but the Thames was never simply a source of clean drinking water. It was a highway, a workplace, a drain, and a boundary all at once. It carried goods and people, but it also carried waste from homes, workshops, and industries. As London expanded, people sought better sources. Public conduits were built to bring cleaner water from springs outside the dense center of the city. One of the most famous systems brought water from Tyburn Springs west of the city into London through lead pipes. Public fountains and conduit houses became important gathering points where residents collected water. Access to these places mattered. Queues formed. Rights were defended. Water carriers made a living transporting it. This tells us something revealing. When cleaner water required organized infrastructure, it also created new forms of dependence and inequality. A household close to a good conduit had an advantage. A servant with time to wait in line had an advantage. A wealthy resident could pay for delivery. A poor laborer at the far edge of the city still faced the daily compromise between convenience and quality. And the conduits themselves were not invulnerable. Pipes broke. Supplies were interrupted. Drought reduced flow. Political conflict and neglect could disrupt maintenance. Medieval infrastructure was impressive, but fragile. A city could feel ordered one month and chaotic the next. Paris, York, Florence, Cologne, across Europe, the details changed, but the pattern was familiar. Growing towns tried to protect and organize water because everyone understood, in practical terms, that disorder here threatened everything else. Even the language of law reveals anxiety. Municipal records show repeated concern over fouling wells, throwing refuse into streams, and blocking drains. Officials were not inventing rules for abstract beauty. They were responding to complaints that touched appetite, smell, illness, and survival. There is a kind of intimacy to these records. Someone was angry because their neighbor dumped waste too close to shared water. Someone refused to clean a ditch. Someone let animals foul a public path. Someone's brewing was affected by bad water. These are not grand political dramas, but they shaped daily life more directly than many royal decrees. And they remind us that medieval people lived in constant negotiation with their neighbors. A clean water source was rarely private. It was shared, contested, and social. Wells especially created small communities of dependence. People met there daily. News traveled there. Disputes began there. A broken bucket, a sick child, a rumor of illness, a suspicious smell. These things became public knowledge quickly. This social visibility also created pressure to maintain appearances. A family known for disorder near a shared well could damage its standing. A craftsman accused of polluting a nearby stream might face not only fines but distrust. Reputation flowed through water as surely as illness could. And yet, for all this regulation and awareness, medieval people still had to live with uncertainty they could not solve. Consider the simple question of taste. Clear, cold water from a spring often tasted best and inspired confidence. But taste could mislead. Dangerous contamination did not always produce bitterness or foul smell. A sweet-tasting well could still be unsafe. Meanwhile, mineral-rich water with an odd taste might be harmless. Judgment depended on senses that were useful but limited. This gap between appearance and reality made drinking water psychologically strange. People had to trust without certainty. We do the same now, of course, but our trust is placed in systems we rarely see. Laboratories, pipes, treatment plants, regulations. Medieval trust was much more personal. It depended on known places and known people. If the village spring had served generations, that memory itself mattered. If a well had recently been cleaned, people noticed. If someone fell ill after drinking from a certain source, stories spread quickly. Memory was a kind of map. Travelers, especially, felt the difference. A merchant on the road could not rely on familiar wells. Inns varied. Streams were unknown. Local advice mattered. Pilgrims crossing long distances often had to trust temporary sources and strangers' recommendations. Bad water on the road could turn travel from inconvenience into danger. This is one reason wine and ale remained especially valuable in travel culture. They were not merely pleasurable. They were predictable. A traveler might trust a known drink more than an unfamiliar well. Hospitality itself often included the offering of drink, partly because safe refreshment was meaningful. Military life sharpened these problems even further. Armies needed enormous amounts of water for drinking, animals, cooking, and camp life. Soldiers on campaign could not choose ideal sources. They drank from rivers, ponds, hastily dug wells, and whatever local supplies could be seized or purchased. Camps created immediate sanitation problems. Waste and water existed too close together. Disease often followed armies not only because of wounds or crowding, but because camp life compressed all the ordinary dangers of water into a more desperate form. A contaminated stream could weaken an army before battle even began. Commanders who ignored logistics paid for it in sickness long before they paid for it in strategy. Sieges were even worse. We often imagine siege warfare through walls and weapons, but inside those walls, water defined morale. A deep, reliable well could mean resistance. A failing cistern could mean surrender. Defenders watched supplies anxiously. Attackers looked for ways to cut access. Rumors of poisoned wells could create panic faster than arrows. In some accounts, wells became almost symbolic, the hidden heart of the fortress. Stone walls protected bodies, but the well protected time. Without water, no defense lasted long. Rural life, meanwhile, carried its own quieter risks. It is tempting to imagine the countryside as automatically cleaner than the town, but rural water safety depended on landscape, season, and local practice. A farm near a clean spring might be fortunate. Another family relying on shallow wells in difficult ground faced constant uncertainty. Seasonal labor mattered too. During harvest, long hours in fields meant quick decisions about where to drink. Shepherds, woodcutters, millers, and field workers all relied on temporary or exposed sources during the day. Rivers and streams were not abstract resources. They were companions to work. And then there were mills. Watermills were central to medieval economic life, grinding grain, powering industry, shaping settlement patterns. But mills also changed water flow. They created ponds, channels, and managed streams. These could be useful and productive, but also sources of conflict. Stagnation near mill ponds, disputes over access, and the altered movement of water all affected nearby communities. A lord controlling a mill often controlled more than flour. He controlled part of the water landscape. That meant power. This is why water history is never just environmental history. It is social history, economic history, and political history at the same time. Who owned the spring? Who repaired the conduit? Who paid for the bridge? Who had the right to fish, wash clothes, water animals, or draw drinking water first? These questions could shape resentment for generations. In some villages, rights to springs or streams were bound up with customary law so old that no one remembered their beginning. In towns, guilds and councils argued over access because trade itself depended on reliable water. Brewers, dyers, tanners, bakers, fishmongers all had different needs and different ideas of acceptable use. And because medieval life was deeply local, solutions were often local too. There was no universal system descending neatly from above. One town invested in conduits. Another relied on wells. One village protected a spring with almost sacred seriousness. Another accepted muddy compromise because there was little alternative. Even climate could redraw the problem from decade to decade. A series of wet years might make one source unreliable. Drought could expose another. The later medieval period, with its climate instability and episodes of failed harvest, reminded communities how fragile ordinary survival could be. Bad weather meant not only poor crops, but also bad water. Flooded pits, stagnant pools, overused wells, stressed livestock. Water sat at the center of all of it. This is where the romantic image of medieval life begins to fade most clearly. It is easy to admire stone cottages, village greens, monastery gardens, and market squares from a safe historical distance. Harder is remembering the smell after heavy rain, when runoff moved through streets and yards. Harder is imagining carrying heavy buckets in winter darkness because the nearest decent source was not close. Harder is understanding how much thought ordinary people gave to something modern life often makes invisible. Even prayer touched this reality. People prayed for rain and for the right amount of it. Too little meant thirst and crop failure. Too much meant flood, spoiled grain, and polluted wells. Holy wells became places of hope not only because of miracle stories, but because water itself felt close to the boundary between divine blessing and everyday survival. A spring that never failed could feel sacred. A well that went bad could feel like judgment. The spiritual imagination of the medieval world was never far from material necessity. This is also why accusations during crisis could become so dangerous. When plague, famine, or sudden illness struck, communities searched for meaning. Water was a natural focus because it touched everyone and because it crossed invisible boundaries. If something had corrupted the water, then the threat had entered the center of life itself. Sometimes blame fell on strangers, minorities, or outsiders with terrible consequences. The fear of poisoned wells during plague years became one of the darkest examples of how uncertainty and suffering could turn into persecution. The historical tragedy here is not only the accusation itself, but how believable it felt to frightened people who knew, from experience, that water could indeed carry disaster. Most suffering, though, came without villains. It came from ordinary structures pressed too hard, a city too crowded, a ditch not cleaned, a summer too hot, a winter too long, a well too near a refuse pit, a servant too tired to walk farther for better water, a family too poor to choose. That is the real story of unsafe medieval drinking water. Not constant dramatic poisoning, but 1,000 quiet vulnerabilities built into daily life. And still people adapted. They learned. They brewed. They regulated. They argued. They carried water across muddy streets before dawn and trusted experience more than certainty. Civilization continued not because the system was perfect, but because people became skilled at living inside imperfection. By the late medieval world, however, another shift was beginning. Slowly, unevenly, and often invisibly. Larger towns were becoming more ambitious about controlling water itself, not just reacting to its dangers. Civic pride, commerce, and survival were pushing communities toward more deliberate systems. And with that change, the ordinary well in the courtyard would begin to compete with something larger. The idea that a city, not just a household, might be responsible for what its people drank. That idea was quietly revolutionary. For most of medieval life, responsibility for safe drinking water was intensely local. A family watched its own barrels. A street shared a well. A monastery guarded its spring. A lord maintained a millstream if it served his interests. But the notion that an entire city should deliberately organize, protect, and deliver cleaner water for large numbers of ordinary residents required a different scale of thinking. It meant treating water not simply as a private necessity, but as a civic duty. This did not happen suddenly, and it did not happen everywhere. Medieval Europe did not wake one morning to discover public sanitation. But as towns grew wealthier and more politically confident, some urban governments began to think less like villages and more like systems. Public conduits became symbols of this ambition. A conduit was more than a pipe. It was a statement that a city could reach beyond its crowded center, claim a cleaner source, and bring that water inward through engineering, labor, and law. Springs outside the walls could be protected. Water could be directed through lead, wood, or stone channels. Public fountains could distribute it. Officials could supervise maintenance. Access could be regulated. Fines could protect the supply. To modernize, this may sound basic. To medieval residents, it could feel extraordinary. Imagine a household accustomed to relying on a questionable neighborhood well now sending a servant to a public conduit known for clearer water. Imagine the social prestige of living near one of these fountains. Imagine the arguments when flow slowed in summer or when someone accused a neighbor of taking more than their share. Because where there is shared necessity, there is always politics. Water carriers became familiar figures in larger towns. They moved through the streets with yokes, barrels, and buckets, selling convenience to those who could pay. Their labor reminds us that even public systems did not erase inequality. Cleaner water still had distance, weight, and cost attached to it. For the wealthy, this could mean comfort. For the poor, it often meant standing in line. Some conduit houses became so important that they were woven into civic identity. They stood not only as practical structures, but as visible proof of urban order. A well-maintained fountain suggested competence. A broken one suggested neglect. Public water became part of how a city judged itself. And yet, even these improvements carried their own ironies. Lead pipes, for example, were sometimes used in medieval conduit systems because they were workable and durable. To modern ears, that sounds alarming, and with reason. But the understanding of long-term lead exposure did not exist in the way we think of it now. People judged water by immediate experience, taste, clarity, freshness, not by invisible chemical danger over years. What felt like progress could still carry hidden risks. This is a recurring pattern in history. People solve the problem they can see and inherit the one they cannot. Even so, better conduits often genuinely improved daily life. A protected spring was usually preferable to a fouled urban ditch. A managed fountain could reduce dependence on contaminated local sources. Municipal investment mattered. It also changed the rhythm of ordinary streets. Public fountains became places of waiting, exchange, and observation. Servants met there. News spread there. Children lingered. Arguments began. Courtships sometimes began there too. The practical act of fetching water created a stage for urban social life. In a world before instant communication, routine gathering places mattered enormously. A conduit house could function almost like a daily bulletin board made of stone and flowing water. And this is where the story of drinking water becomes unexpectedly intimate again. A widow might hear of a neighbor's illness while filling her bucket. A brewer might learn that the spring flow was weak this week. A merchant's servant might complain that the queue was longer because travelers had arrived for the fair. A rumor of disease might spread before the priest ever announced it. Water carried information as well as thirst. At the same time, domestic caution never disappeared. No public fountain removed the need for judgment inside the household. Water still had to be stored. Barrels had to stay clean. Buckets themselves could become sources of contamination. Rainwater had to be collected carefully. Food preparation still mattered. Brewing still mattered. The line between public safety and private habit remained thin. This is especially clear when we look at kitchens. Medieval kitchens were environments of heat, smoke, ash, grease, and constant movement. Water entered that space not as a sterile product, but as part of messy labor. It was poured into pottage, mixed into dough, used to rinse vessels, wash hands, soften grain, clean fish, and cool hot tools. Safety often came not through drinking plain water, but through transformation. Soup, broth, pottage, porridge, ale, and wine diluted or cooked with water became part of ordinary survival. The kitchen was, in many ways, the household's own small treatment plant without anyone calling it that. Boiling was valuable, even when people explained its benefits differently than modern science would. A pot over the fire could make suspicious water more usable, whether the household thought in terms of humors, purity, or simple practical experience. This helps explain why medieval diets were so deeply tied to liquid foods. Pottage, soups, and broths were not merely culinary preferences. They were efficient, nourishing, and often safer ways to turn grain, vegetables, scraps of meat, and water into daily meals. A cup of plain cold water was only one part of hydration. Much of life's moisture arrived disguised as food. This is another quiet correction to modern assumptions. When we imagine drinking water, we often imagine glasses of it. Medieval people lived in a broader fluid world where water entered the body through ale, soup, broth, diluted wine, medicinal drinks, and cooked grains. The question was rarely just, is the water safe? It was often, how can this water be made useful? That distinction matters, and it mattered especially during illness. When sickness entered a household, water became part of care. Broths for the weak, warm drinks for the feverish, herbal mixtures, diluted wine, cautious feeding of children. Even without modern medicine, hydration and nourishment were recognized through practice, if not always through theory. Women, servants, and caregivers carried much of this invisible medical labor. Their decisions about water, food, and domestic cleanliness shaped survival more than official medicine often did. A physician might prescribe, but the household managed the body, and medicine itself reflected water's uncertain reputation. Medieval medical texts often discussed which waters were healthiest. Rainwater might be praised in one context, spring water in another. River water could be judged by movement and clarity. Physicians considered temperature, weight, taste, smell, and supposed effect on the balance of the body. Some advice now sounds strange. Some sounds surprisingly sensible. Avoid stagnant water. Prefer clear, flowing sources. Be cautious of marshy ground. Pay attention to smell. These were not foolish instincts. They were observations filtered through a different intellectual system. People without germ theory were still capable of careful noticing. Bathing adds another layer to this story, because it is often badly misunderstood. Popular myth likes to imagine medieval people as permanently filthy and afraid of washing. Reality was more uneven. Public bathhouses existed in many towns, especially in earlier medieval and late medieval urban life. Private washing, partial bathing, and practical cleanliness mattered, though habits varied by wealth, region, religion, and period. But bathing required water, fuel, labor, and trust. A hot bath was not only a luxury of time. It required carrying, heating, and managing large amounts of water. Bathhouses depended on supply systems. Cleanliness was constrained by infrastructure, not by a simple lack of interest. And water for bathing did not need to meet exactly the same standards as drinking water. Households constantly made distinctions. This for the pot, this for the tub, this for the animals, this for washing clothes, this for brewing. Water had categories. People learned to think in layers of use rather than a single standard of purity. Even laundresses and washerwomen understood this deeply. Washing clothes near streams and riverbanks was hard physical labor shaped by the qualities of local water. Soap, ash, boiling, scrubbing, drying. Clean linen required enormous effort. A cleaner shirt was not simply about appearance. It could affect comfort, smell, status, and health. Again, water sat quietly underneath everything. And because it was so ordinary, it was easy for elites and chroniclers to ignore until it failed. Kings left records of wars. Households remembered which well had gone bad. One of the most revealing sources for historians is often not a grand chronicle, but a complaint. A town record about blocked drainage, a legal dispute over spring rights, a monastery expense for repairing a conduit, a household account for paying water carriers. These fragments show where real anxiety lived. People write things down when ordinary life stops working. That is why water history survives in such practical documents. It was not abstract philosophy. It was urgent routine. Sometimes these routines also collided with religion in unexpected ways. Fasting rules, feast days, monastic discipline, pilgrimage journeys, all changed patterns of food and drink. Holy wells remained places of devotion. Processions might pray for rain. Drought could be read spiritually as well as materially. But sacred belief rarely replaced practical judgment. A pilgrim might trust the blessing of a shrine and still ask where the cleanest spring was. Faith and common sense were not enemies. And across all of this, children were learning. They learned which stream not to drink from after rain. They learned how heavy a bucket felt. They learned which well belonged to whom. They learned that a horse upstream changed the choice downstream. They learned household rules that sounded simple but carried generations of experience. Do not use that ditch water for cooking. Take the smaller pail to the spring. Wait for the ale to settle. Cover the barrel. Do not waste the boiled water. These were lessons in survival disguised as chores. In that sense, medieval water knowledge was deeply cultural. It was passed hand to hand, not only book to book. A grandmother's warning about a bad well could matter more than a physician's theory. And because so much depended on local memory, disaster could strike hardest when memory was broken. After war, plague, migration, or famine, newcomers did not know trusted sources. Destroyed villages lost their habits. Displacement turned invisible local wisdom into sudden vulnerability. This is one reason post-plague Europe could feel so unstable even beyond mortality. The social map of trust had been damaged. Water, like everything else, had to be relearned. As the later Middle Ages moved toward the early modern world, population shifts, trade expansion, and stronger urban governments slowly changed expectations. People began to demand more from cities. Clean water became not just fortunate, but increasingly political. Who had access? Who paid? Who decided? The old village logic of shared wells was still there, but it was now living beside something larger. The beginning of civic responsibility for health itself. That change would take centuries to fully unfold. It would survive failures, epidemics, neglect, and astonishing resistance. But its roots were already present in these medieval streets, in the conduit queues, in the fines for fouling a ditch, in the arguments over drainage, in the recognition that private caution alone was not enough. because eventually, too many people drinking from the same uncertain sources forced a harder question. Not whether one family could protect itself, but whether an entire society could. That question did not arrive as a clean philosophical debate. It arrived through smells in the street, children with fevers, overflowing ditches after rain, merchants complaining about foul water near markets, and councils realizing that private caution could not solve public danger. When too many people lived close together, one household's problem became everyone's problem. This is where medieval drinking water begins to connect to something larger than survival, the slow birth of public health, long before the phrase itself existed. No medieval mayor stood up and announced the invention of sanitation policy. But city governments, monasteries, guilds, and local authorities were all gradually learning the same lesson. Clean water could not be left entirely to chance. It required rules, labor, money, and sometimes force. Street cleaning ordinances were one part of this. In many towns, residents were expected to keep the space outside their homes reasonably clear. Refuse could not simply be thrown wherever convenient. Drains had to remain open. Animal waste had to be managed. In practice, of course, enforcement was uneven and often frustrating, but the existence of these rules matters. They show that medieval communities recognized connection. The butcher's blood in the street did not stay only the butcher's problem. The blocked drain outside one house became the flooded lane of 10 houses. The pig wandering near the public fountain was not merely someone's animal. It was a risk shared by everyone drawing water there. This way of thinking feels surprisingly modern. It is not modern science, but it is social logic. And it often collided with resistance. People dislike inconvenience in every century. A tanner told to move farther from town because his work polluted the water did not necessarily agree politely. A householder fined for dumping waste too near a stream might argue that everyone did the same. A merchant paying new taxes for conduit repairs might resent the burden. Water governance was never only technical. It was political because it touched habits, money, and power. Guilds were deeply involved in this world. Certain trades depended so heavily on water that they became part of the argument over who deserved access first. Brewers needed large, reliable supplies. Bakers needed water for dough and ovens. Dyers and fullers worked constantly with cloth and liquids. Fishmongers, butchers, and leather workers each brought their own forms of waste and demand. One person's necessary trade was another person's contamination. This made urban planning, even in a medieval sense, an ongoing compromise. Offensive or water-heavy trades were often pushed toward edges of towns, near rivers but away from central wells when possible. Yet profit always tempted people back toward convenience. Markets wanted proximity. Customers wanted access. Workers wanted shorter distances. Cities were never as orderly as their rules hoped. And there is something deeply human in that. The same tension exists now. People want clean environments and easy convenience at once. Medieval towns were negotiating the same contradiction with fewer tools. Weather, again, could destroy careful plans overnight. A heavy storm could turn a managed street into a channel of mud and waste. Floods overwhelmed drains and latrines. A river that served as transport and fresh water could suddenly carry contamination through entire neighborhoods. Spring thaw released months of winter accumulation. Summer heat thickened smells and accelerated decay. Water management was not a one-time achievement. It was maintenance without end. This endlessness shaped labor. Someone had to dredge ditches. Someone had to repair broken pipes. Someone had to clear silt from channels. Someone had to inspect wells, patch barrels, carry water, clean conduits, and argue about who had failed to do it last week. Most of this labor was invisible to elites unless it failed spectacularly. The smoother a system worked, the less anyone praised it. But when a conduit stopped flowing or a well turned foul, suddenly everyone noticed. Water labor was successful precisely when it disappeared into ordinary life. That invisibility often meant the work fell hardest on those with the least power. Servants, laborers, apprentices, women managing households, hired cleaners, ditch workers, water carriers, these people formed the hidden infrastructure of medieval survival. A nobleman might praise the quality of the household ale without thinking much about the servant who had walked half the morning to secure good water for brewing. A monastery might value discipline without naming the lay worker clearing the drainage trench in winter rain. History often remembers the owner of the well, not the person lifting the bucket. And yet the bucket mattered more. Even legal records show this imbalance. Property rights are written clearly. The exhaustion of carrying water usually survives only indirectly. But if we want to understand medieval life honestly, we have to follow the labor downward into kitchens, yards, and streets. Consider a laundress working beside a cold stream. She is not engaged in a romantic village scene. She is lifting wet linen heavier than dry cloth, scrubbing with aching hands, managing soap or ash, watching weather, protecting fabric, and depending entirely on the quality and flow of nearby water. If the stream is fouled, the work becomes harder. If the weather turns, everything changes. Or consider a brewer's wife checking whether yesterday's collected water will ruin a batch. A mistake is not just inconvenience. It is wasted grain, lost calories, and money the household may not be able to spare. These are not background details. They are the structure of ordinary life. And this is why medieval people were often far more observant about practical water than modern stereotypes allow. They watched color, smell, movement, animal behavior, seasonal changes, and neighborhood reputation because they had to. Their understanding was empirical even when their explanations were framed through religion or humoral medicine. A muddy stream after rain was suspicious. A spring that suddenly tasted different mattered. A neighbor complaining of sickness after using a certain well-changed behavior. Observation created survival. Sometimes this knowledge became almost ritual. Certain wells were always covered. Certain springs were approached with particular respect. Certain streams were used only for washing, never for drinking. These habits could appear superstitious from the outside, but often they were practical wisdom protected by tradition. Tradition is a powerful form of public health. People obey old rules more easily than new lectures. And sometimes those old rules preserved life long after their original reason was forgotten. A family might insist on drawing water only from a specific place because that is how it has always been done, not because anyone could explain underground contamination. Yet the custom still protected them. This reminds us not to confuse explanation with intelligence. Medieval people often lacked modern scientific vocabulary, but they did not lack pattern recognition. The danger came when pattern recognition failed against invisible threats. A clear well poisoned by seepage looked trustworthy. A healthy-looking child drinking from it could become sick days later. Cause and effect separated by time are difficult for any society to grasp. That difficulty shaped medicine for centuries. Physicians could advise, but many diseases linked to contaminated water, intestinal illness, dysentery, recurring fevers, were inconsistent enough to confuse certainty. Some survived, some did not. Families interpreted results through religion, luck, constitution, or morality. Was the child weak? Was the season cursed? Was the food spoiled? Was God testing the household? Sometimes the water was only one factor among many, and that made truth harder to isolate. History is often less a matter of ignorance than of too many possible causes. And so medieval people lived in a world of overlapping explanations. A priest might speak of divine judgment. A physician might speak of imbalance. A grandmother might blame the old southern well after rain. All three could influence the household at once. This layered thinking was not irrational. It reflected a world where certainty was rare. Even plague years sharpened rather than simplified these tensions. During outbreaks, authorities cleaned streets, restricted movement, inspected suspicious areas, and searched desperately for practical causes within the limits of their understanding. People feared bad air, corruption, poisoned wells, moral decay, and contaminated goods all at once. We should be careful not to laugh at that fear too quickly. When death moves invisibly, human beings look for patterns. Medieval people were doing what people still do, trying to turn uncertainty into action. Sometimes that action was wise. Sometimes it was tragic. The poison well accusations against minorities during plague years remain one of the clearest examples of fear becoming violence. Communities that knew water could carry disaster found it easy to imagine deliberate sabotage. Anxiety about health became suspicion about neighbors. The lesson here is uncomfortable because it is timeless. Infrastructure is never only physical. It is also trust. Who belongs? Who is blamed? Who is believed when danger comes? Water, because it enters every household, sits at the center of these questions. And still, life had to continue. Markets opened. Children fetched buckets. Ale was brewed. Monks prayed. Travelers asked which spring was safest. Servants waited at conduit houses in winter wind. The ordinary day did not pause for perfect knowledge. This may be the most important truth of all. Medieval people did not solve unsafe water. They lived with it. They built routines around uncertainty. They created habits strong enough to carry ordinary life forward despite hidden risks. That quiet endurance is often more impressive than dramatic innovation. But innovation was coming slowly. By the later 15th century and into the early modern world, stronger municipal governments, larger trade networks, and growing urban pride pushed some cities to think more aggressively about infrastructure. Better conduits, stricter regulations, planned drainage, protected springs, these were still incomplete, still unequal, but they signaled a change in expectation. A city was no longer judged only by its walls, markets, or churches. It was increasingly judged by whether it could sustain life cleanly. Visitors noticed fountains. Merchants cared about urban order. Residents demanded reliability. Civic pride attached itself to water. This shift did not erase the old world overnight. Wells remained central. Buckets remained heavy. Rural villages still depended on springs and streams exactly as before. But the mental horizon had changed. People were beginning to imagine that cleaner water was not merely fortunate, but something that could be organized. That idea would outlive the Middle Ages. It would pass into Renaissance cities, through outbreaks of disease, through expanding trade empires, through the crowded growth of early modern capitals. It would survive repeated failures because every generation rediscovered the same truth. Private cleanliness means little if public water is unsafe. And somewhere in a late medieval town, standing beside a public fountain newly repaired at great expense, a resident watching the clear flow into a wooden bucket might not have called it public health. They might simply have called it relief, because after centuries of compromise, even a little more certainty felt like luxury. And from that small luxury, expectations grew. Once people experienced even a modest improvement in water access, it became harder to accept the old compromises without complaint. A public conduit that delivered cleaner water did more than fill buckets. It changed the imagination of what a town owed its people. What had once seemed like ordinary hardship began to look like preventable disorder. This is how infrastructure quietly changes culture. It alters not only daily life, but what people believe should be normal. A resident who had spent years relying on a muddy neighborhood well might begin to see that same well differently after using a cleaner public fountain. The old water had not changed. the expectation had. That shift is easy to miss in history because it does not arrive with a single dramatic event. It arrives through habit. People become accustomed to less sickness, better taste, shorter walks, fewer arguments, more reliable brewing, cleaner kitchens. They begin to notice absence as much as presence. When the conduit stops working, frustration is sharper precisely because improvement had been possible. This growing expectation also changed relationships between rulers and the ruled. Medieval government, especially at the local level, was often judged through visible practical results. Could roads be maintained? Were markets orderly? Did drains function? Was bread affordable? Did the fountain run? A failed water supply could damage trust in authority faster than abstract political theory ever could. People forgive distant philosophy more easily than a dry bucket. This was true in castles and villages alike. A lord responsible for land and settlement could be judged by whether wells were protected and mills functioned. A monastery that managed water poorly risked more than inconvenience. It risked its reputation for discipline and order. A town council unable to keep streets passable or fountains flowing invited resentment. Water became a measure of competence. It also became a measure of status between cities. Prosperous urban centers competed not only through trade and architecture, but through visible order. Fountains, conduits, bridges, paved areas, and managed drainage signaled seriousness. Travelers noticed them, merchants valued them, chroniclers sometimes praised them. A city with reliable public water looked civilized in a very literal sense. This did not mean everyone benefited equally. Wealth still shaped access, and the poor remained closest to the edge of uncertainty. But even unequal improvements mattered because they created pressure for more. There is a subtle political lesson here. Once a society proves something can be better, that is simply how life is becomes a weaker excuse. And so late medieval and early modern urban life slowly developed a sharper awareness of shared vulnerability. The plague years had taught terrible lessons about invisible danger. Expanding trade brought more strangers, more goods, and more crowded streets. Population growth meant less space between waste and water. Authorities could no longer pretend that household caution alone was enough. The city itself had become a body. The streets were arteries. Its drains were circulation. Its fountains were vital organs. No medieval council would have used those exact words, but the instinct was there. Disorder in one part spread to another. Health was collective whether people liked it or not. This way of thinking would later support much larger transformations, but its emotional roots were ordinary and immediate. A mother wanted her child not to fall sick from the neighborhood well. A brewer wanted consistency. A merchant wanted customers not to avoid a foul-smelling street. A priest wanted fewer funerals. Public systems begin in private frustrations. And there were always limits. Technology could improve access, but not erase uncertainty. Pipes cracked. Wells collapsed. Springs failed in drought. Floods ignored careful planning. Corruption diverted funds. Maintenance was expensive and never glamorous. Even the best-designed conduit depended on people continuing to care. That last part is often the hardest. Building a fountain creates celebration. Paying for its repair years later creates argument. Medieval records are full of this tension. New works were praised. Maintenance was resented. Yet, without maintenance, improvement became memory. A town proud of its conduit one decade might complain bitterly about neglect the next. Infrastructure is less a monument than a relationship. It asks the same question every year. Will you keep choosing this? The same was true inside the household. A clean barrel stays clean only if someone scrubs it. A protected well stays protected only if someone covers it. Good ale remains reliable only if someone brews carefully. Health rested on repeated attention, not heroic moments. This is perhaps why the subject of water feels strangely intimate. It reduces history to repetition. Not kings and battles, but carrying, boiling, cleaning, watching, judging. It is history measured in trips to the well. And because it is repetitive, it shaped emotion in quiet ways. There was relief in hearing the bucket strike clear water. There was dread in finding the well muddy after rain. There was irritation in a long queue at the conduit. There was embarrassment in asking neighbors for help when illness made carrying impossible. There was comfort in familiar taste. There was suspicion when that taste changed. These are small emotions, but they structure a life. They also shaped memory. Ask someone to remember childhood, and often they remember not policy but sensation. The smell near the stream in summer, the sound of the pump, the weight of winter water pails, the warning never to drink from the lower ditch. Medieval people lived inside those same sensory maps. This is one reason holy wells and springs remained powerful even as urban systems improved. A spring could be practical and symbolic at once. It gave real water and represented something deeper. Continuity, blessing, local identity. People did not divide the sacred and the useful as neatly as modern categories suggest. A clear spring in uncertain times felt like grace. Likewise, a fouled well could feel like moral disorder as much as physical danger. If the water source at the center of a community became corrupted, it seemed to reflect more than bad drainage. It touched the moral imagination of place itself. This symbolic weight mattered during crisis. Famine, plague, drought, and flood all turned water into a form of judgment in people's minds. Was God withholding rain? Had the town become careless? Was illness punishment, warning, or simple misfortune? Medieval explanations layered practical concern and spiritual meaning together. Even those who thought pragmatically still lived in a culture where nature and morality spoke to each other. And yet, despite all the symbolism, daily necessity always pulled people back to practical choices. The horse still needed watering. The soup still needed boiling. The baby still needed something safe enough to drink. Grand philosophy often ends at the kitchen door. This is why women's labor sits so quietly at the center of this history. They were often the managers of household risk, deciding which water to trust, when to boil, when to brew, when to save fuel, when to walk farther, when to ignore advice because exhaustion left no alternative. Official records rarely praise this judgment, but it shaped survival. A wise grandmother who knew exactly which spring turned bad after autumn rain could protect a family more effectively than a distant physician. A servant who refused to fill from a suspicious well might save a household without ever being remembered. History depends heavily on unnamed competence. The same is true for children who learned responsibility early. Carrying water was not symbolic discipline. It was necessary work. Children understood quickly that water was heavy, time-consuming, and not to be wasted. A spilled bucket was lost labor. A broken vessel meant trouble. This created a different emotional relationship to water than most modern people experience. Water was not assumed abundance. It was effort. That effort shaped manners too. Wastefulness looked rude because it was costly. Hospitality involving drink mattered because it represented real labor. Offering a traveler good ale or clean water was generosity, not small politeness. Even class display touched this. A wealthy household serving fine wine signaled status, but so did the invisible confidence of reliable clean water for cooking, washing, and comfort. Luxury often hides inside the ordinary. A noble guest might admire tapestries while the real privilege sat unnoticed in the well-maintained within the walls. And there were places where this privilege became extreme. Royal courts and great noble houses could create insulated water systems, private wells, controlled springs, servants dedicated to supply. Yet even here, complete safety was illusion. Court life was crowded. Kitchens were enormous. Waste still existed. Disease still moved through invisible channels. Rank changed the margin for error, not the laws of nature. This is one reason outbreaks could reach every level of society. Kings and peasants both depended on bodies vulnerable to the same hidden dangers. Water did not erase hierarchy, but it reminded people that some dependencies were universal. It also tied the countryside to the city more tightly than either sometimes liked to admit. Urban conduits often depended on springs and streams beyond city walls. Protecting urban water meant controlling rural landscapes. Fields, grazing rights, mills, and village habits suddenly became urban concerns. A city might demand that nearby land be managed differently to protect its supply. Villagers might resent that interference. Water made power travel outward. This pattern feels familiar because it never disappeared. Cities still reach into distant landscapes for their safety. The medieval version was simply closer, more visible, and argued face to face. A farmer might see the town's needs arriving as new restrictions near a spring. A town official might see the same rule as common sense. Both were defending survival. This is why water disputes could last generations. They were never just technical disagreements. They were about whose life counted first. And still, even with better conduits and stronger expectations, the old world remained stubbornly present. Most people still lived close to uncertainty. Wells still went bad. Streams still flooded. Buckets still had to be carried. Ale still had to be brewed. A city fountain did not erase a village ditch. History rarely replaces one system with another. It layers them. A merchant in a prosperous town might enjoy public conduit water while his sister in the countryside still judged every drink by the smell of the spring after rain. Both lived in the same century. This layered reality is what makes the medieval world feel both distant and familiar. The technologies are different, but the emotional logic remains recognizable. People wanted safety without impossible expense. They wanted convenience without hidden cost. They wanted to trust what sustained them, and they wanted someone else to be responsible when that trust failed. That last desire, perhaps, is the bridge into the modern world. Because once communities accepted that clean water required shared responsibility, a much larger question followed. If unsafe water could quietly kill, then was allowing it merely unfortunate? Or was it a failure of government itself? That question would not fully mature until centuries later, through industrial cities and scientific revolutions. But its first shape was already there in medieval streets, in complaints about wells, in conduit taxes, in fines for dirty drains, in the simple anger of people forced to drink what they knew was wrong. A civilization begins to change when ordinary discomfort becomes politically unacceptable. And in the long history of drinking water, that change often started not with a king or a doctor, but with a resident standing over a bad well, looking down into water they no longer believed they should have to trust. That moment, standing over a bad well, looking down into water that should have sustained life but instead carried doubt, was one of the quiet turning points of history. Because once distrust entered something as basic as drinking water, it changed how people thought about the world around them. A foul well was not simply unpleasant. It was evidence that ordinary life could fail at its foundation. Bread could be baked badly and corrected the next day. A road could be muddy and still passable. But water touched every hour of existence. If water became uncertain, the entire structure of daily life felt less secure. This is why medieval communities reacted so strongly to signs of contamination. The response was rarely calm because the stakes were never small. Imagine a village discovering that its familiar well had begun to smell wrong. No laboratory would explain the cause. No official test would arrive with certainty. Instead, there would be observation, rumor, argument, and instinct. Someone would insist the taste had changed weeks ago. Someone else would blame the heavy rain. Another would suspect the new refuse pit dug too close by. A priest might be asked to bless the place. A practical neighbor might argue for digging deeper. A widow would quietly begin sending her grandson to the farther spring instead. This mixture of practical action and anxious interpretation was not irrational. It was survival under uncertainty. And uncertainty shaped community relationships in ways modern plumbing has largely hidden from us. Today, many people never meet the person responsible for their drinking water. In the medieval world, responsibility was often visible. You knew who owned the nearby land, who neglected the ditch, who let pigs roam too freely, who had refused to help repair the shared well cover, who controlled access to the cleaner spring. Water made blame local. That could create solidarity. Villages often cooperated to protect a trusted source because everyone understood the shared benefit. But it could also create bitterness. If one family seemed careless and another paid the price in illness, resentment lingered long after the fever passed. These tensions were especially sharp around boundaries. A stream crossing one field into another was never just water. It was obligation moving downhill. A landowner upstream had power whether he admitted it or not. Waste dumped there might arrive later as someone else's sickness. Medieval legal disputes about streams and drainage were often, at heart, disputes about invisible consequences. The same logic applied inside towns, only compressed. A narrow lane with houses pressed close together left little room for mistakes. Overflowing privies, broken gutters, refuse pits, stable yards, kitchen runoff. Everything was close to everything else. Rain did not respect property lines. The more densely people lived, the less private sanitation could remain. This helps explain why urban authorities became increasingly interested in paving, drainage, and street regulation. Mud was not merely aesthetic failure, carried waste. Standing water was not simply unpleasant. It invited danger. Even the slope of a street mattered because it shaped where filth traveled. A clean street was a health policy long before it was a civic beauty project. And there is another quiet irony here. Medieval people are often imagined as indifferent to dirt because modern standards of hygiene are so different. But many urban regulations show the opposite. People noticed filth intensely. They argued over it constantly. They simply lived within material limits that made perfection impossible. A town council could order streets cleaned, but without modern sewers, paved systems, and reliable waste removal, clean remained a negotiation rather than a stable state. That gap between intention and reality defined much of medieval life. It is easy to underestimate how much effort went into maintaining even modest order. Buckets had to be emptied somewhere. Chamber pots had to be carried. Animal dung had to be moved. Rain barrels had to be checked. Wells had to be lined, covered, and protected. Drains had to be reopened after storms. Civilization at ground level looked like repetitive chores. And because these chores were repetitive, they shaped the emotional climate of households. There was a difference between a home near a trusted spring and one near a foul ditch. It changed appetite, sleep, hospitality, even marriage prospects. A house associated with bad smells or unreliable water carried social weight. Domestic reputation mattered. Visitors noticed the taste of ale. Neighbors noticed the state of the yard. Potential in-laws noticed whether the household seemed orderly. Cleanliness, in the broad medieval sense, was partly moral language. It suggested discipline, competence, and respectability. This is why servants and household managers were judged so closely. A badly run kitchen could damage status far beyond the kitchen itself. If food spoiled, if washing was neglected, if brewing failed, it reflected on the household's honor. Water sat beneath all of that. A noble table with silver cups still depended on someone deciding which well to trust. And sometimes that trust failed dramatically. There are scattered accounts of wells becoming unusable after dead animals fell into them, after flooding carried contamination, after neglect allowed walls to collapse, or after siege conditions turned enclosed water sources dangerous. These were moments when the hidden fragility of ordinary systems became suddenly visible. A dead dog in a village well was not a small inconvenience. It could become a crisis. Who would clean it? How long would the water be unsafe? Where would everyone drink meanwhile? Who was responsible? Such events reveal how thin the line between ordinary routine and serious disruption could be. This was especially true in winter. Frozen ground complicated everything. Wells iced over. Streams became harder to access. Carrying water through cold darkness added risk and exhaustion. At the same time, indoor life increased dependence on stored supplies, heated liquids, and close domestic management. Winter water was labor with consequences. A mistake made in summer might be unpleasant. In winter, it could become dangerous quickly. This seasonality is easy to forget because modern water arrives with almost no relationship to weather. Medieval people felt the climate directly through every drink. Drought had a taste. Flood had a smell. Spring thaw changed the safety of familiar places. Autumn rain altered the route children took to fetch water. Water was not a stable utility. It was a living part of the landscape. This made local knowledge priceless. Outsiders could be vulnerable not because they were foolish, but because they lacked the map held in ordinary memory. A traveler might see a clear stream and drink without hesitation. A local child would know not to, because the tanner's runoff reached that bend every Tuesday. This is why inns mattered so much. A trustworthy innkeeper offered more than a bed. They offered guidance, what to drink, what to avoid, where the safest source lay. Hospitality was partly information. Travel without local water knowledge meant constant negotiation. Pilgrims felt this strongly. Long religious journeys were romanticized in stories, but physically they meant sore feet, uncertain shelter, strange food, and unfamiliar water. Holy destinations were reached through very ordinary risks. Even the miracle of pilgrimage required someone asking where the safest well was. At the same time, monastic houses often became islands of relative order in this uncertainty. Their discipline, resources, and continuity made better water management possible. Controlled fish ponds, protected springs, organized drainage, and regulated domestic labor gave some monasteries a reputation for stability. Yet monasteries also reveal the limits of control. They depended on lay workers, surrounding land, seasonal weather, and human frailty like everyone else. Their cleaner systems were achievements, not escapes. And because monasteries recorded life carefully, they preserve evidence of how much attention water required. Repairs to conduits, purchases for wells, management of infirmaries. These details show that spiritual life rested on material maintenance. Even prayer needed a functioning kitchen. This truth applies everywhere in medieval society. Grandeur depended on buckets. Castles, cathedrals, universities, royal courts, all required the same basic negotiation with water. Without reliable supply, prestige became fragile. A university town full of scholars still needed someone to keep drains open. A bishop's residence still depended on servants hauling water. History loves the visible monument and forgets the unseen system beneath it. But the system is often the more honest story. This becomes especially clear when we think about childhood illness. Medieval parents lived with a level of uncertainty that modern medicine has made emotionally distant for many people. A stomach sickness that might now be treated quickly could then become frighteningly serious. Was it bad food? Teething? A seasonal fever? Corrupt water? Divine trial? weak constitution. Often they could not know that uncertainty made prevention precious, even when imperfect. Better water mattered because certainty did not exist. A mother who insisted on boiling something first was not performing theory. She was protecting hope, and hope in a world of frequent loss was practical. This is perhaps the deepest reason drinking water mattered so much. It sat at the meeting point of ordinary life and mortality. Every cup carried trust. Every illness tested that trust. Every improvement felt disproportionately meaningful because it touched fear so close to home. A cleaner conduit did not just improve convenience. It reduced dread. That emotional history is harder to measure than laws or pipes, but it may be the most important part. People do not fight fiercely over abstractions. They fight over what keeps children alive. As Europe moved further toward the early modern period, scientific understanding would remain incomplete for a long time. Germ theory was still far away, but social understanding kept growing. Communities increasingly recognized that water problems were collective, that infrastructure mattered, and that the health of strangers could become the health of one's own household. This recognition changed politics slowly, but permanently. It made rulers answerable for drains. It made civic pride flow through fountains. It made engineers as valuable as warriors in certain moments. And it created a strange new kind of expectation that government should protect life not only from enemies outside the walls, but from dangers moving silently within them. That expectation would take centuries to mature, but its roots were muddy, local, and very ordinary. Covered well, a repaired conduit, a fine for fouling a stream, a market street finally drained after years of complaint. These did not look like revolutions, but often history changes most through things that stop people from getting sick. And somewhere in that slow transformation, the old medieval relationship with water began to shift, from accepting risk as fate, toward treating at least some of that risk as a problem human beings were responsible for solving. It was an incomplete shift, uneven and fragile, but once it began, it was difficult to reverse. Because after a person has tasted cleaner water, after a household has lived through fewer unexplained fevers, after a city has seen what better management can do, the old excuses lose their force. People begin to ask harder questions. Why is this well still like this? Why is that drain never repaired? Why must the poor drink worse water than the rich? Why does the city praise its cathedral but ignore the ditch beside the market? And once those questions are spoken aloud, they do not disappear. They move from kitchen conversations to council chambers, from village complaints to urban law, from household frustration to political expectation. And in that movement, something larger than water begins to emerge. The argument is no longer only about thirst or even illness. It becomes an argument about what a community owes itself. If people share streets, markets, walls, and risks, then perhaps they also share responsibility. The bad well in one corner of town is not separate from the life of the whole place. It is part of the same body. This idea sounds familiar now because we live inside its descendants. But in the medieval world, it was still forming slowly, shaped by inconvenience more than philosophy. People did not begin with a theory of collective welfare. They began with the simple recognition that one neighbor's neglect could become another neighbor's burial. That recognition was powerful because it was repeated daily. A blocked drain after rain. A smell rising from the lane behind the baker's house. Children told not to play near a certain ditch. A brewer complaining that the latest batch had turned sour because the water had changed. These were not rare disasters. They were ordinary reminders that private life was never entirely private. Even wealth could not fully escape this truth. A noble family might have servants and better access to water, but they still lived inside a town's wider ecology. Disease did not respect gates perfectly. A household with clean plates and private chambers still breathed the same air, bought from the same markets, and relied on the same laboring population whose health shaped everything else. This is one reason plague terrified elites as much as the poor. It exposed how fragile separation could be. And although plague was not a simple water story, it intensified awareness of invisible connection. If illness could travel through unseen channels, then the management of ordinary life suddenly felt more urgent. Wells, drains, markets, waste disposal. None of it looked minor anymore. People began to understand that prevention was a form of power. This was not modern epidemiology, but it was an important emotional step. A town that cleaned streets, repaired conduits, and protected springs was not merely being orderly. It was defending itself. That defense required money, and money changed everything. Who should pay for public water? This question sounds technical, but it was deeply political. Taxes for conduits, repairs for fountains, labor obligations for drainage, fees for access. These were never neutral decisions. They reflected whose comfort counted and whose burden was assumed. The poor often paid in labor. The wealthy often paid in influence. And the city itself stood somewhere between them, trying to keep enough order that trade continued and anger did not boil over. A merchant might support conduit repairs because cleaner streets meant better business. A landlord might resist new costs while still demanding cleaner surroundings. A guild might defend access for its own trade while ignoring the hardship of those fetching household water. Public good was always negotiated through private interest. This is not a medieval flaw. It is a human one. Yet despite conflict, the expectation kept growing. Once towns had examples of better management, the memory of disorder became less acceptable. A resident who had seen a functioning conduit would not easily accept a return to stagnant wells without complaint. Memory, again, became infrastructure. This is true in another sense as well. Medieval records preserve not only laws, but habits of frustration. Repeated complaints about the same drainage ditch, the same polluted stream, the same neglected well tell us that people were not passive. They were persistent. They knew when something was wrong. Sometimes the most revealing historical document is not a great law code, but a tired complaint repeated for the 10th time. Please repair this drain. Please stop dumping refuse here. Please protect the public well. Please make the fountain work again. History is often built from people asking the same practical question until someone finally listens. And those questions were asked most forcefully by those closest to the problem. Women managing households noticed water first because they met it first each morning. Servants noticed because they carried it. Children noticed because they were sent for it. Craftsmen noticed because bad water ruined work. Priests noticed because illness filled funerals. Physicians noticed because recurring sickness defied easy explanation. The experience of unsafe water was democratic in a way few things were. It reached across rank, even if not equally. This is why the subject resists the neat story that medieval people were simply ignorant and modern people are enlightened. The truth is slower and more complicated. Medieval people were often highly attentive to the consequences of bad water. What they lacked was not concern, but the scientific framework and infrastructure to fully control it. They knew enough to worry. Sometimes that was the hardest position of all. To suspect danger without being able to prove it creates a particular kind of anxiety. Produces habits, superstitions, arguments, and rituals. It also produces humility. Many households lived with the knowledge that they could do everything right and still lose someone. That humility shaped religious life too. Water was central to Christian symbolism. Baptism, cleansing, purification, blessing. Holy wells attracted devotion not simply because they were miraculous in imagination, but because water itself was already emotionally charged. It represented life, danger, healing, uncertainty. A spring that ran clear year after year could feel like grace because grace was what it provided. Likewise, corruption of water felt morally unsettling. A poison source was not just dirty. It felt like disorder entering the moral center of the community. This symbolic weight explains why accusations of well poisoning during crisis became so explosive. The fear touched both body and soul. But outside moments of panic, most people returned to the ordinary discipline of adaptation. They learned which seasons made trouble. They learned which neighbors were careless. They learned how far to walk for better water when a child was sick. They learned how much wood they could spare for boiling. They learned when to trust the ale and when to risk the well. This was practical intelligence shaped by repetition. And repetition shaped the landscape itself. Paths worn to trusted springs. Stones placed around wells. Covered barrels beneath roofs. Shared washing places downstream. Mill ponds that redefined fields. Conduits that changed where people gathered. Water left architecture behind. If you walked through a medieval town slowly enough, you could read its water story in stone. A public fountain in the market square told you where civic pride wanted to be seen. A cluster of workshops near a river told you where industry needed flow. A lane sloping toward a drain told you where people hoped waste would disappear. A monastery's carefully channeled stream told you how discipline had been turned into design. Even silence told stories. An abandoned well, a dry cistern, a broken conduit. These were historical sentences written without words. And because water shaped place so completely, it also shaped imagination. People described good land through water. Fertile, well-watered, spring-fed, healthy. A settlement without reliable water was not simply inconvenient. It was unstable. To found a village, build a monastery, establish a castle, or expand a town always required the same first question. Where will the water come from? Everything else followed. A castle without a secure well was a gamble. A monastery without controlled supply was vulnerable. A town without protected sources was an argument waiting to happen. Water was not an accessory to civilization. It was the first draft of it. This becomes especially visible during war. Armies marching across Europe did not move according to maps alone, but according to rivers, wells, and supply routes. A general might admire walls, but he studied wells. Siege warfare was often less about breaking stone than exhausting water. Defenders counted days through barrels and cisterns. Attackers looked for springs beyond the walls. A poisoned or blocked source could matter more than bravery. In those moments, the entire grandeur of medieval warfare reduced to the same truth as village life. People survive by what they can safely drink. There is something almost humbling in that. Beneath banners, prayers, laws, and dynasties sits the same ordinary dependence. The king and the shepherd both require water. The difference lies in who must carry it. And perhaps that is the quietest form of inequality in history. Not only who drinks best, but who lifts the weight. A servant crossing a courtyard before dawn with heavy pails understood the politics of water more directly than many rulers did. Their back carried policy. This is why modern nostalgia for the medieval past often feels incomplete. We admire stone houses, candlelight, village greens, and castle walls. We imagine simplicity where there was often exhausting maintenance. We see the aesthetic and miss the labor. Clean water, especially, reveals how misleading that nostalgia can be. A picturesque well in a village square is charming only if someone is not sick from it. The romance of the past often depends on forgetting the practical risks people were managing every day. Yet it would also be wrong to turn medieval life into a cartoon of misery. People found competence, beauty, and dignity inside these routines. They built habits that worked often enough to sustain generations. They celebrated springs, shared labor, improved conduits, and protected what they could. They were not merely victims of bad systems. They were active negotiators of imperfect ones. That matters because history should not flatten people into either fools or sufferers. Medieval people were neither. They were skilled at living in a world where certainty was rare. And perhaps that is why this topic still feels strangely close. Modern people trust invisible systems too. We assume pipes, treatment plants, inspectors, and engineers have done their work. Most of us rarely think about the water in a glass until something breaks. A boil notice, a strange taste, a contamination warning. Then, suddenly, we think like medieval people again. Who controls this? Can I trust it? Who knew? Who is responsible? The distance between centuries becomes smaller than we expect. Because the emotional structure remains the same. Water is ordinary until trust fails. And once trust fails, it becomes the center of life. That is why the medieval story of unsafe drinking water matters. It is not really a story about people in the distant past being less advanced. It is a story about how fragile civilization feels when the most basic necessity becomes uncertain. It is a story about invisible systems, unequal burdens, and the slow realization that survival is often collective. And as Europe moved further toward the early modern age, those lessons would only deepen. Larger cities, longer trade routes, denser populations, and repeated disease outbreaks would force communities to think even harder about the relationship between health and governance. The humble well would remain, but it would increasingly exist beside a new expectation that rulers should do more than protect walls and collect taxes. They should protect the water itself. And once that expectation takes hold, history begins to move in a different direction. And once that expectation takes hold, history begins to move in a different direction. The Middle Ages did not solve the problem of unsafe drinking water. Most people still lived with uncertainty, and many of the great public health revolutions lay centuries ahead. Wells would still fail. Rivers would still carry both life and waste. Children would still be sent with buckets before sunrise, and households would still judge a day partly by whether the water tasted right. But something important had changed. People had learned, slowly and often painfully, that water was not simply a gift of nature or a matter of private luck. It was shaped by choices: where a town built its streets, where waste was thrown, who maintained the conduit, who paid for repairs, who had access to the cleanest source, and who was left to manage the risk alone. That realization is one of the quiet foundations of the modern world. When we turn on a tap today, most of us do not think about drainage law in a medieval market town, or a servant waiting at a conduit house in winter rain, or a village arguing over a foul-smelling well after a flood. But those older struggles are part of the same story. The expectation that clean water should be normal did not appear suddenly. It was built from centuries of ordinary frustration. From women carrying heavy pails farther because the nearer well had gone bad. From brewers ruined by one careless source of contamination. From monks repairing channels again after another harsh winter. From town councils tired of the same complaint about the same blocked drain. From parents who buried children without ever fully knowing why. History often remembers crowns and battles because they are loud. But much of civilization is built by quieter things. Pipes, buckets, wells, ditches, and the stubborn refusal to accept preventable suffering as fate forever. That may be the real lesson hidden inside a simple medieval cup of water. It reminds us that comfort is rarely simple. Clear water in a glass is not only convenience. It is trust. It is labor made invisible. It is engineering, law, memory, and countless generations of people insisting that ordinary life could be safer than it had been before. And perhaps that is why this subject lingers. Because water is so ordinary, it reveals people most honestly. It shows what they fear, what they tolerate, what they protect, and what they believe a community owes its weakest members. A castle wall tells you how people defended power. A well tells you how they defended life. And in the medieval world, defending life often meant standing in mud before dawn, lowering a rope into darkness, listening for the sound of the bucket meeting water, and hoping that what came back up would be enough. Enough for the soup, enough for the ale, enough for the child with the fever, enough to get through another winter, enough to trust tomorrow. That quiet hope, repeated across centuries, is far less dramatic than the stories we usually tell about the past. But it may be closer to the truth of how most people actually lived. Not in constant grand events, but in the management of ordinary risk. Not in castles alone, but in kitchens. Not in speeches, but in routines. And so when we imagine medieval life, perhaps we should think less first about kings and more about the well in the center of the village. The place where news traveled, where arguments began, where labor gathered, where sickness was feared, where relief was felt, and where the line between comfort and danger could be as thin as the taste of a single drink. If you had lived there, that might have been the most important place in your world. Not the church tower, not the Lord's Hall, the well, the place where survival arrived bucket by bucket. And maybe that is the most quietly humbling part of history, realizing how much of human life depends on things so ordinary that we only notice them when they fail. What part of that world feels hardest for you to imagine living through? The uncertainty of illness, the labor of carrying water, or simply never being fully sure if something as basic as a drink was safe? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoy these calm journeys into the overlooked parts of history, subscribe and come back for the next one. There is always another ordinary detail from the past that turns out to explain far more than we expect. Until then, thank you for listening.